What happens when your bard takes badgering to the extreme? Let me describe the situation. Before I start, I'm a little fuzzy on some of the details, but in my defense, this happened almost 6 years ago now, and my memory isn't the greatest. But I thought this experience was pretty fitting for the subreddit though, and after reading/hearing so many great stories, I decided to sit down and relive my own. So here it is, the time my first ever D&D experience was almost ruined by a creep. At the time of this story, I'd recently turned 20, and I had just come out as transgender. I had only just started living as a man publicly for maybe a couple months or so at this point, and I was nervous about meeting new people or going out in public at the time. I had a great group of friends who were extremely supportive of me, and to this day, I'm grateful to them for backing me up so much in the beginning. I'm very short, 5'3" or thereabouts, and rather effeminate looking, especially then, as I not start any hormone treatment. My voice was high-pitched, and I hadn't really learned how to dress to help myself pass. This is unfortunately relevant to this story, or else I wouldn't be mentioning it. I was actually working for a local game space at the time this story took place. I can't say it was the best job in the world, but the staff were excellent, and we're all friends to this day. It also allowed me to meet lots of cool nerdy people, some of whom were LGBTQ. It served food, and I got a staff discount, so it wasn't unusual for me to go there on my days off if I was also in town for a cheap meal. Anyway, one day I went there to grab a bite to eat before heading home, and I bumped into a friend of mine. Let's call them Mavis, as that's the name of their character. We chatted for a while, and they told me that they were just about to go to a brand new D&D campaign at the gaming shop just across the street. There were 3 nerdy shops all on the same street. The game space where I worked was opposite a big forbidden planet, and a small independent comic/board game shop where the game was taking place. I'd never really looked into D&D before, but I wanted to try tabletop role-playing, as I grew up doing text-based roleplay chat and was really into board games, so I thought it sounded exciting. They mentioned that there was a space for another player and asked if I wanted to come along, with the DM's permission, of course. Well, luck would have it that the space was still open, and so I created my first, and still one of my favorite D&D characters. I'll admit I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing, but Mavis was very kind in helping me create my character, and we decided to make them friends, since we would be joining together. And thus, Finley was born. I believe we were using the Unearthed Arcana for Shifter class at the time. Mavis was a wolf/dog shifter, and Finley was a deer/goat-like long strider. I didn't fully understand how shifters worked, so he just sort of looked half-shifted all the time, and was essentially a fawn. Mavis was very headstrong and beefy, but had very low intelligence and charisma, so I decided to make Finley the yang to her yin. He was small, nervous, and somewhat shy, but could be surprisingly diplomatic and quick thinking. His background was pretty bare bones, but basically he was found abandoned in the forest by a mixed-race hippie commune, and decided to leave to find out more about the world he was so isolated from. His friend Mavis received an invitation to meet with the guilds of Waterdeep for some work, and the two boarded a boat and headed over together. The DM was kind enough to approve my character, and even took the time to go over the rules very slowly with me as we played. The rest of the group seemed really nice, There were technically two DMs who were very close friends. They both had DM NPCs and swapped in and out depending on which arc we were doing. Although I've heard some horror stories about DM NPCs, I'll admit that these two were done very well, and were neither overpowered or at the forefront of any particular scene, but were more a way to act as guides and information points if we got stuck or found ourselves backed into a corner. They were members of the same guild, one a paladin, the other a barbarian, both of whom wanted to rise in the ranks, but were right now stuck supervising the newbies, aka us. I was really relieved that, aside from me and Mavis, there were two other LGBTQ players in the group. There was the mysterious Rogue, a trans woman who is one of the loveliest people I've ever met, and later became one of my closest friends. And also an evil sorceress named Regina, played by a man who was excellent at playing up the Mother Gothel vibes. Then finally, there were those two. The first was a bard who was super annoying, but the second, a human paladin, would be the real cause of my problems. Because there are two paladins, I'll refer to him as Ponytail, as the player had long hair and always tied it back like that. At first, he didn't really stand out that much, probably because the bard was so much more obvious in his irritating decisions. I was very new, so I hadn't had to deal with a group dynamic like this before. I was really interested in the role-playing aspect and got really into my character from the get-go, taking on a meek and quiet voice that only got louder if he was excited or enraged by people insulting his friend. I loved the dynamic between him and Mavis, and it helped that I had someone I already knew to bounce off of. I also loved the concepts for the rogue and the sorceress, both of whom he was pretty intimidated by at first, but had some great in-character interactions. Like I said, the DM's barbarian and paladin characters were pretty quiet and in the background, but he still connected with them, admiring the barbarian's strength and seeing the paladin as someone to respect. Ponytail Paladin was extremely quiet. He didn't seem that interested in roleplaying, but I figured that was normal, especially if he was new to the game. The only reason I was so quick to jump in was because I had that support. The bard was unfortunately very quick to play his character. That is, play an annoying jerk who ignored the group's plans to do whatever he wanted, even if it made no sense, and refused to listen to criticism. To start with, he decided to get a pet badger in the first session, which he decided to use as a comedic piece to poop on anything he disagreed with. Sometimes literally. Characters talking too much in an important scene? Badger poops RPs on them, so they have to go clean up. Merchant won't lower their prices for items he's way too poor to buy? Badger mauls their ankle. Attractive female NPC talks to us at the tavern? Badger starts doing his thing on her leg. I'm sure you get the idea. Nobody actually found this funny, especially as he loudly talked over everyone about whatever his badger was doing, and often refused to roll checks for it or listen when the DM said that it was impossible. Outside of playing his character, he was also very disruptive, interrupting people when they were talking and constantly talking about irrelevant things when we're trying to play. The shop was only open for around 3 hours once a week for D&D, so that was the maximum amount of time we had for any one session. The bard didn't actually last that long, and that was largely because of our first real combat. I don't remember fully what was happening. We were maybe 3 or so sessions in, and I think we were exploring some kind of underground warehouse when we were cornered by some bandits. This was a tough but well-planned fight, and one of the first excuses for us to actually battle together as characters. Both myself and Finley were very uncertain about using magic, so we mostly stayed in the back and tried to blast whatever he could in panic, along with the sorceress. The front lines were the DM NPCs, the Ponytail Paladin, and Mavis. And the Bard? Well, instead of bluffing or healing people, he decided to try cutting up people with his rapier, and loudly talking about how his badger ran around peeing on the bandits and biting them. Again, while refusing to roll. The main line are taking some serious damage. The main DM's Paladin NPC was surrounded and about to go down, and even I could tell that this was going very badly. We all reminded him that he was the only one with healing magic at this point. We were all level 1, or maybe 2, and the Paladins either didn't have lay on hands yet, or had already used it earlier. The DM told him on no uncertain terms that if he didn't start healing, it was likely that someone would die. And what did he say on his turn?
My badger runs over and poops on your paladin, and I hit the nearest bandit with my rapier.
So yeah, the Paladin, the supervisor to our employer, who is supposed to be assessing our capabilities, dies right then and there in front of us. The barbarian rages at the death of his fellow guild member, creating enough of a distraction for the rest of us to abandon the fight, and the rest of us barely managed to escape. This was the final nail in the coffin. The DM, fed up with the Bard's disruption, decided to ban him from the game. I will note that this was not the first time he'd been called out for his disruptive behavior, and all of us were getting tired of him. It wasn't just a reaction to his NPC getting killed. The DM was actually very level-headed and willing to put up with us, so I don't blame him at all for this decision. We didn't actually see that fallout, just that the Bard had been kicked from the group chat on Facebook, with an explanation from the DM. I was relieved, as I wasn't sure if it was just me who was put off by his behavior. The other players reassured me that I wasn't, and that it wasn't normal or necessary for me to put up with it. We took a week's break for the DM to figure out how this would change the campaign, and I looked forward to coming back to a more peaceful group. Oh boy, if only I'd known how much worse things were going to get. So this 3-parter is supposed to be about a creep, but we only get to the Bard in this one, who just sounds like a child. To hear about the actual creep, you're gonna have to listen to Artificial DM and Z Flacco's parts. But as always, before you go, what do you all think about this situation?